since the advent of what is now known as South African hip hop, there have been the emergence of what I would call the three millennial kings. I think during the course of your history, Mzansi rap, um, more than many would agree with me when I say that a lot of people, when we depict our quote unquote Mount Rushmore of SA hip hop in terms of rap, we are talking about AKA, we are talking about Pro Kid, we are talking about Double HP, and arguably, based on what perspective you're approaching it with, from a business or a cultural perspective, we're either talking about KO, Questa, or Casper Nyovest. But I think there are rappers who have emerged as King of Kings, and I think if we're talking Pro Kid and we're talking AKA, there would be a more than unanimous agreement that those tend to be the most resilient acts that have made the broadest set of South Africans identify with this beautiful thing of ours we love called rap music. And I think coming out of that era, there seemed to be a search for a new candidate, new kings, new artists who would reign in their generation to show us the dominating curves of the culture of our times. And I think an artist who many felt was the golden child, touched by something that many before him wanted, was Nasty C. Here comes Junior Ngobo,
In full, it's C and A-Reece.
a kid from Durban, basically an early Gen Z. This is the interesting thing about Nasty C's age, is that born in 1997, that makes him about 2 to 3 years older than the Gen Z, and it makes him technically a late millennial, but it puts him in a sweet spot between the culture that has come before and the culture that we are in right now. Nasty C is a young man who was in a unique position of understanding how far SA rap has come, but also being influenced very much fundamentally by what was going on in his generation. And what was going on was a shift in technology, that was globalizing the world increasingly. These things we carry today were becoming to be the fundamental signature of culture as we lived it. And how it changed youth interaction, music, and culture is that it made a kid from South Africa feel more closer to the rest of the world. And how did that impact our style? You find that kids coming after have more of a globalist approach in their art than thinking about the local cultural aspect. And this is part of the Gen Z generational scourge, if you may. Nasty C Opuma right in that midst, and what made him so special is that he was the Americanisms that all SA rappers wished they knew how to mimic, wrapped in the South African applicable imagery that was cool for the times. And so you found him being co-signed by a lot of OGs, Slicker, Doomy, virtually the whole hip-hop game, aka included, was dubbing Nasty C the king of the next generation. Musically, he was not disappointing. He was a child of the Drake-esque sound, basically bringing it to a voice which spoke of the streets of what the youth were experiencing in that moment. He drops his mixtape, which is still critically acclaimed, Price City, and the rest is history. He evolves into becoming an artist who is criticized for his globalism, but seems to feel that the direction of his music is more focused on bringing the world to South Africa rather than bringing South Africa to the world. So he becomes a world artist, and he sacrifices his South Africanness in many aspects. I mean, when you listen to Nasty C, a content that immediately says South Africa. The Mzansiisms are not there, culturally, linguistically, and even to a large extent aesthetically. He does not represent the larger demographic of the youth in South Africa. He represents a certain kind of niche market that is large enough to anticipate but to also cater to the crowd that we're in. And as a result, the global relationship with where he's at turns him into a megastar. And it's this relying on the global aesthetic and attraction of his music that we as the Headspace, just personally, have criticized for episode on episode on episode, for review on review on review. If you don't believe me, we'll probably play a couple of clips so that you can see how far we've consistently focused on Nasty C's lack of what we call the A factor, the authentic factor. This factor that says that you are part of a global generation, but you're also very rooted in the things that are happening to your people first. Allowing your art to not drown in the monotony of what's popular or trendy, but have something distinct. Nasty C didn't quite have that thing. He had something many thought would pay off, which is an affinity to American culture. But when you actually get to America and you do them, you will never be able to do them better than they do themselves. And this is something that, I, in these reviews and just generally the platform that we are as the Headspace, has highly criticized Nasty C and his, what many would say, rival and peer, C and A-Reece. These are two artists who are placed in the same dilemma of feeling that their generational crossover international appeal matters more than a searching for identity in the local and indigenous sense. And this is something I don't think works. I think wherever you are in the world, you've got to tell your own unique individual story. And when you've been influenced by other people's cultures, yours is to find the delicate recipe that allows for you to be something emergent, new from this influence, and not just be a carbon copy of a culture you feel is cool because it dominates, because that's the only thing you're exposed to the most. So I'm approaching this review as a critique of two artists, but also in a larger sense, the culture that they come from. On one hand is Nasty C with his album Free, and on the other hand is A-Reece with his album Business as Usual. And in an interesting way, these two projects juxtapose and say two different things of where we are, which are both equally true and relevant, I claim. So let's start this thing. I'm setting these projects up together because if you don't know and you've been living under a rock, these two artists have had a sordid beef, which I would say was caused more by their public appeal than anything which might have happened between them personally. I think fans have always pitted Nasty and Reece against each other because they seem to be two sides of the same coin. A-Reece coming from the Pretoria aspect of things, and Nasty C coming from the Durban aspect of things. So you can kind of say a lot of the political provincial beefs in South Africa play them out through these two artists. Because when you really look at Reece and Nasty, they are more complementary than they are competitive. I mean, these are two guys who are basically doing the same thing. And so when you put two people like that together and they're playing the same game, it's generally a matter of taste more than who's actually doing it better. Because I think it's been shown and proven that they both have the lyrical chops, they're both technically proficient, they both have great songwriting capability, and as a result they both understand how to stick to their core base by understanding their artistic identity they've chosen themselves. So in a way, there has never been a real niche one artist has over the other. It's been more of a tug of war amongst the fans, and you find a silent reverent respect that both artists have had for each other, albeit most recently admitting it. So I'm glad that the whole beef angle has kind of played out, and for the most serious aspect of it all, the two artists are beginning to come together in a way where they could even be on one joint, rumored to have been requested and put together by Ustogi D himself, bringing together these two artists to kind of have a conversation about a lot of things, including both of their place in the history of South African rap. So let's get to the review without any further ado. Now, Nasty C has been in a place that is pretty much the entrance of his mature stage. He's an artist who has mostly been defined by club bops, but now he's kind of slowing down the pace of his trap friendliness to give us a perspective that is about reflecting on the legacy so far. This is somebody who basically threw all his hopes and dreams in the hope that he would be South Africa's first global sensation. I mean, you look at the way Nasty was moving, including the deal he would later sign to Def Jam. It was all to position himself in this mythology that a lot of rappers have wanted as a wet dream for South Africa, to have one of our own become a GOAT in the American world. And I think Nasty C was pushed to be that export at a time in his life where he might have not understood the rules he was playing. Because the moment he came to the States, he drowned. I mean, let's be honest. We will look at the accolades of collaborating with people like the ASAPs, people like the Ray Shermans of the world. But if we actually look at the reality of it, Nasty was operating in a field which in America is lower than the one he comes from in South Africa. In Africa, he's A-list. In America, he basically became a lower rung trap upstart. And when you start like that, and you want the dream to be as you as a continent representative, you're not starting in the right place, because you're not starting with the payback and the support of your culture behind you. You're starting as the best bet Africans have at trying to be American. So as a result, it puts us in a place, and it puts Nasty C in a place where his whole career was being played by American rules, and he played himself to be in this context by sounding American, by having his whole sound and aesthetic not say anything visibly or aesthetically or culturally African. I mean, I'm not looking for typical racial tribalisms. I'm not looking for Nasty C to come rocking a music video with Ipeshu and to try and force some vernac into his language. I'm looking for reference. An artist has a reference. Slang, the things that you talk about, the world you paint. When you listen to the way that Nasty C usually tells his stories, he is influenced by African American slang for the most part. There are very few, if any, Mzansiisms in his music. Previously, leave that. And his image and his whole style says United States of America. Up until he realized that in America, that basically makes him invisible, because he's another wannabe rapper. So he felt the, one might say, desperate need to find in himself that South Africanness. And then we enter into the Zulu Man with some power era, where he tries to be South African by saying things that feel South African to an American audience. Steve Biko, Shaka Zulu, you give Americans still an Africa they know, but you're not really tapping into the Africa that's the reality of where you come from. You're not tapping into the slang, you're not tapping into the sounds, the samples, the historical music heritage. You're not tapping into any of that, and I think that's why many of Nasty C's albums just didn't fluctuate to the place that a lot of South Africans would have hoped. The marketing was there, the money was there, the branding was there, but you know why I, as VJ, think Nasty C just could not work as an international artist? Is because he is full of international stereotypes, but he is empty of his own local cultural identities. I'm not saying the dude doesn't know who he is, because that is who he is, but he doesn't know how to take who he is and translate it in a way that will allow for Americans to see the rest of where he comes from, the aspects that might not be classically hip-hop but are South African. So I think he began to see the need to lean on this, and then we enter into his now famed verse in Lemonade. For the first time ever, he's incorporating South Africanism. He's talking about Benny McCarthy. He's talking about South African dancers. He's incorporating vernac and isiZulu into his raps in a way that feels organic and unforced. And I think this is what made him reflect on the challenges of what went wrong during his tenure in trying to be more American than anything else. I think the album is called Free on two levels. Nasty is now literally free from what he calls a bad record deal. And secondly, he's free in a spiritual sense. Because when we go into the texture of this project, Nasty is Nasty C for a reason. And we must be able to admit this as people who both understand and don't understand why he's such of a big deal in Mzansi. I'll tell you why. This global shift that was going on because of social media and the way that it influenced AMA 2000 manifested itself in younger generations who are more concerned with finding their place in the world than understanding their place in the context of their own country. AMA 2000 don't generally give a shit about SA politics and the culture and how it impacts them as a youth, because they're too busy seeing themselves as part of a greater culture. A culture of Kai Sanat, a culture of I Show Speed, a culture of people who are becoming famous in their bedrooms over streams, people who are taking the capacity of where they are culturally and transcending it to a certain extent. But I think a lot of the Gen Z youth are forgetting the fact that to be resilient, you will need to understand your story. To blow, you just need to be trendy, but to be resilient, you need to understand your story. I said that twice. Shout out to Dr. Umar. So, where I'm going is Free is a testament of Nasty's unapologetic globalness. He refuses to try and be trapped in stereotypical South African identities. He doesn't want to sample Kwaito. He doesn't want to sample Kro. He doesn't want to sample Amapiano, because none of that really means anything to him on a personal level. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't think we are in any position to judge the moral merit of who he is as a person. I can only judge how it manifests musically on both sides. Him being so unapologetically global and not being a lot of rooted, grounded historicisms in his work, in his texture, him not even having anything vaguely isiZulu in the texture of his samples. He could take anywhere, whether it be at a Puzi Chemisi joint, whether going into Statamia, whether sampling whatever, Ladysmith, Black Mambazo, Johnny Clegg, the Shaka Zulu movie itself. There are pop Zuluisms that I think would be great additions to Nasty's international aspiration. But he doesn't do that because, I don't know, he probably wouldn't feel that. And so he stays true to these trap bells and whistles, these airy 808s, these flowery beats that are club ready, these bops. That's what Nasty does. He takes beats that fit neatly into the landscape and he just tells you where he is at the moment. And at the moment, he sounds like a mixture of Lil Baby and Drake. And I think it gets to a place where you might as well be listening to them because it just fits within that mold. What says him in all of this? Because when I look at the project, there's a very strong tell when you listen to the track Lefty with Blackie. Somewhere along the song, he says, I come from the jungle, yeah, nigga, and it's a catchy little hook. But it was funny to me listening to a South African reference the American version of a song which caused a lot of controversy. When he says, yeah, nigga, awumawe, it's referencing The Lion Sleeps Tonight, awumawe, awumawe, a song which was stolen from South African composer Solomon Lina, whose rights were never credited for the song. Disney stole a South African man's song and cleansed it of the isiZulu, because originally that song says Imbube, Imbube. So Americans turn Imbube to Awumawe, and who does Nasty C reference? He says again, I come from the jungle, yeah, nigga Awumawe. This is how a South African sees himself. The stereotypical image of the jungle nigga. Just a poppy jungle nigga. A trendy jungle nigga. And I think there's a problem there when you're so kind of disjointed from what makes Africa modern, postmodern, cool and funky, that your only references to your Africanness is kind of some racist shit. Because when you're gonna say, I come from the jungle, nigga awumma way, you might as well scratch your armpits and just bark like a gorilla. Because you're that close to feeding into a white American stereotypes of what is African. And this is why, to VJ, Nasty C always loses internationally. He doesn't say the pride of King Shaka. He says the black knuckle dragging nigga that America's white complex has designed for many rappers to try to fit into grills, dancing, debauchery, and everything. And I'm not saying these things in themselves are the culprit. I'm saying an artist who does not understand the politics of these things. The politics of saying awim away instead of Imbube. I don't know if Nasty C even knows the story of Solomon Linda. Peep that. Might post a link in the description. These are very important stories of where we come from, and Nasty C doesn't seem to find value in becoming a depository for these kind of stories. What he cares about is on the song Smoking, he talks about how his most important priority is staying on top as an artist, understanding his position in this country. What he basically waxes lyrical about in this project is fundamentally the fact that he's now free from the label, which I quote, this was a very interesting tell when he says on the song Switch, he says, they want me to switch on my bros, they want me to switch my clothes, they want me to switch the goals. And I think this echoes a lot of what might have been whispered to Nasty on a business level. Exactly what I'm saying. You're kind of too American to pass as an authentic African. Change a little bit of who you are. And I respect Nasty C's insistence on being this globalist Gen Z. But it also shows in a way the priorities when the business of the art and the creative politics of it all comes together. Because through this project, Nasty references this transformation of himself, going through the stages of navigating his South African fame, but not reaching this American vision. And ultimately, I think in summarizing the essence of this project, from songs like Soft that have made themselves as a single there with Usmamane, another young rising star in the generation of South African rap, you have, for me, which is probably the most prominent and best song on this project, is the song That's What's Up, where he kind of slows down the pace of his pop grooves and he focuses on an introspective moment. And it sounds like Drake when he's tapping into more of the MC side, but it's the sentiment of what Nasty C is rapping about and what he feels is important to his career right now that sticks. He's a family man. He's trying to navigate his art with integrity, and say what you will, say what I will of Nasty C. He knows who he is, and it's the complex politics of who he is that I think he still has to figure out. A-Reece, on the other side, in contrast to Nasty's freedom of exploring the self, is in a place where it's business as usual. It's business as usual in what sense? At about the point where A-Reece's origin story breaks from Ambitious Records, we are outside of the era of Paradise, and we are in a brooding young MC, disenchanted with the hopes of being a South African superstar and understanding the power of the internet. A-Reece probably amasses what I feel is the biggest cult following outside of mass market commercial South African fandom. He shows the business model for how artists can be free of traditional record label models by basically betting on the power of his core cult fan base, and they support him irreverently by making him one of the biggest rappers outside of commercial radio. A-Reece sets the trend for many of even the previous generation to finally have the balls to go out of their contracts and finally see the power in going independent in a social media era where there are more opportunities to navigate platforms that, be they merch, be they alternative forms of streaming that link directly to your account, be they starting your own record label or stable, which A-Reece later did with his brother and many of the collective that he rolled through in the Pretoria hip-hop scene. Enter a story where he's having the most fun because it's according to his terms. And I think if there's any glaring difference between the two cats, Nasty has always played the more traditional story, whereas Reece represents a lot of the innovation that is seen possible, even though they are peers in the same generation. They show two attitudes. One that still feels the pressure of the old guard when it gets high enough, and one that still has the ambition to rely on the grassroots to bring it to the world stage. I mean, for goodness sake, the Slimes brought Reece into features with people like Euro, Droog, and spaces in the rap scene where he's kind of solidified himself alongside more of the new wave boom bap sound, the drumless Griselda-esque sound, than he is trap nowadays. Because even here on Business as Usual, it's a delicate balance of not classically club oriented, but more an intimate, open, sparse, ambient atmosphere where the beats are stripped down, they're very minimal. Reece is basically going into not much of a thematic individual story of himself. It's going through the motions. There's nothing new he's saying. He wakes up, he smokes weed, he plans ahead to the next gig, he goes and he kills it, he's grateful for his fan base, and he does the same thing over and over and over again. A-Reece is in a comfortable place, a rare place, a place where a South African artist can probably make bank on the strength of the shows that they do alone, and still has the popularity and rising interest from the rest of the world to figure out what the rest of the story might be. And so I think this is the most interesting thing of the Nasty C A-Reece generation. We have two doors. One door says we still have to somehow please big mass capital. One says that's cool, but we first have to understand how to reach those of us who are like us. And I think these two doors lead to one stem. They navigate capitalism, because capitalism will always find a way to sell you to yourself. Who ultimately is Nasty C and who is A-Reece? I claim they are two South African youth of a generation that is losing the core of what makes it South African and sees itself as a global youth. A youth where being South African is more of a location than it is a cultural experience, because this is a youth who are innovating their own steps, but in a direction that does not engage with what is going on in the homegrown environment, but seeks to go to further heights. And this is the politics of globalism and localism. I think in the end, these are two planes of one existence that we all need to navigate. The old saying goes, think local, but act global. And I think A-Reece and Nasty C are still in a place where they are thinking global, and hence they have an inability to act local, because on both ends they're just finding themselves in a place where more and more of their own identity is being defined by a youth whose cultural features are coming from this virtual online reality and the kind of trends that it comes with, from the hype beast culture, from the disorientation of Gen Z in America. And this is why you'll find that even in their references, A-Reece is more likely to reference a paid in full reference where he talks about Meech than he is a Yizo reference. He's not talking to South African youth, he's talking to the world. And who is the world in the popular sense? It's America. That's why Americans can host local tournaments and call them world tournaments. That's why Americans can make movies about the destruction of the world and it's New York going in flames. And this is the problem when Africans do not see the value of what they bring into that hyper-real world of sensationalism and illusion. And I think the two kings of our era are proving to be servants of the American empire. And I think, and that is why the millennial kings, the AKAs and the pro kids and the proverbs still reign supreme, because they still belong to a generation that understood that it has to tell the African story to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world has already tried to tell our story in a way that slants us as backwards, as invisible as one American president says, a shithole. So if you see yourself as jungle orientated and you reference Awimmawe instead of Imbube, you're bound to still remain in the same place where the American white complex wants you to be. So, so ultimately, what am I arguing about? What am I going on about? I ultimately, in light of these both albums, am saying essentially the previous millennial generation of aka Pro Kid, Kulichana, Proverb were rappers that understood that only they could tell their story to the rest of the world, and it was a unique story that was not told by the world to them. And when I say the world, again, I am talking about i.e. America, which poses itself as the world, which takes its own mass marketed appeal and its empirical and imperial power and shoves it down the rest of the world's throat. And so as a result, you've got a generation of people who responded to that and said, no, there's a whole lot of things about us that only we could tell to the world, because you will never tell the authentic story of South Africa. There's still a colonial thread to cross there, and I think the next generation has betrayed that. Nasty C and A-Reece have betrayed the act to think local but act global, and it's thinking locally that roots you in understanding how, even as internationally influenced as you are, how do you tell stories that are unique to your people? How do you tap into real organic bonds with the generation that you are part of across the spectrum of class and gender and race? How do you become indicative of your country? Maybe not as a whole, but characteristically. You take rappers like Maclera Dope Boy on the other side, who are trying this, and it seems to be working more than the formula that A-Reece and Nasty C have relied on, the globalist formula of sounding like a South African version of Drake, of taking your stories and drowning them in the language of the online world, which tries to be this residual space where identity and history isn't that important, when it is the core of what allows us to innovate in the first place. And so as a result, both A-Reece and Nasty C seem to resort to these cheap attempts at sounding South African. For example, Nasty C has this thing at the back of the song Schmokin, where he samples Amaflate whistles as actual ad-libs. And it made me think that that's the closest he could ever really do to having something uniquely South African. He's got drums that try to echo a bit of where we are in South Africa right now. And it's these kind of tactics of sampling the landscape of South Africa from a place which is more inauthentic, because it tries to navigate the popular South African things, but it doesn't tell the popular South African stories.
And even Masipus.
There we go. So these references come across as desperate. And I think what we have ultimately are two young rappers who are true to themselves, but the self is not anchored in where they come from. And I think they still have a journey to travel as far as realizing how being South African doesn't necessarily mean rapping ngeStswana or in isiZulu. It means something a whole lot more. It's a melting pot of a whole lot of different things that are happening in TikTok, on TV, in our culture, in the hood, in the suburbs. There's so many things we can talk about. Rather a rapper reference General Mkhwanazi than Chuck Norris. We can tap into Papa Action instead of Tony Montana, Scarface. There's so many South African archetypes and ideas of cool, danger, rebellion, debauchery, youth, power, fire, dream telling. Rather, I talk about Salomaki Kancube than Denzel Washington. And I think this is the power of rap. Rap references culture and it tells a story. And this is what we loved about the rappers of old. My God, dating myself. Is that South African rappers previously to this generation understood the power that rap was a culture code, and that the things you rap about becomes the code of the culture of the streets. They let the rest of the world know where your people are at, and that isn't existent in Nasty C and A-Reece's work. So if it's business as usual for Reece, then I think he's doing the American business, and it won't serve him as an African. And if Nasty is free to be part of the world, I think he needs to understand that this world agenda is more of an American agenda, and maybe his freedom really isn't as free as he thinks he is. He should play Boom Shaka free and maybe learn a little bit of what freedom was perceived as from a South African perspective. With those words, my name is VJ, the brother from the ancient mother. Classically, with the reviews, I would do a rating at the end. In this chapter of Headspace reviews, I'm learning that ratings are part of the problem, and I think it's possible for me to emerge with a sense of what I think the project was about and the artist is trying to achieve, and whether they did that without using a metric that will again put me and the artist in a position of trying to outdo themselves or outdo the game. So expect a whole episode on ratings and whether or not they actually work really soon, because this is the first of many episodes that we are going to do now without the rating system. I'm going to do something a whole lot more interesting next time, but you've got to keep on watching to find out what that is. In the meantime, subscribe to the Headspace if you like what this is about. That's what we do, South African and African culture at large, navigating where we are as Africans in the art space. Much love.